Hi everyone, I'm Guillaume. I'm the founder of Nine Dot Studio, which I started in 2011. My role there is both as a CEO and as a creative director. Before that, I worked in QA for 3 years. So yeah, I've been in this industry for a little bit over 15 years now. My main motivation when I created Nine Dots was that I felt that there was a lot of waste. We were wasting talent, wasting our medium as well. I saw people get burnt out and leave the industry before even reaching 5 years of experience. And I've seen games being released in a very pitiful state, just way too soon. And so I had this very specific company culture that I had in mind. I wanted to work smart instead of working hard. I had a lot to prove myself with all of those big words that I would have. So I needed to attain very high productivity. It was the best way for me to prove that we were being wasteful. So over the past decade, what I'm going to propose today is all stuff that has been tested and tweaked and discussed internally countless times. Nine Dots, my studio, is mostly known for making Outward. It's an open world RPG with a lot of content. It was made over the course of 4 years with a team of between only 6 and 10 developers. So we had a budget of less than $2 million, while most games of its scale have usually budgets between 5 and 20 millions. We ramped up since the release of the game, and we are now 27 employees. So one success could really be leveraged to get bigger. I'm going to warn you now, I will talk very fast because I have a lot to cover, and I want to give you as much actionable knowledge as possible. So first, a disclaimer, no, I did not use the scientific method, so I'm going to make a lot of claims like they're pure truth, but this might not be the case. This is not a university thesis, and productivity is subjective. So yeah, it's very healthy to have doubts, and test it out yourself and decide whether or not I'm a fraud. And I'm always open to conversation. I'm still learning today. The fact that I still care about it is how I got where I'm at, and I hope I'm going to get even better with time. Okay, I'm going to start right here. There's no silver bullet to attaining high productivity, but there is a silver machine gun. What I mean by that is you can't expect one magical jump in productivity just from one measure. But when you stack them all, you get a compounding effect, and that can be very powerful. So you need to thoroughly analyze your context and think about all the options at your disposal. And this is why I structured the presentation like this, with just a ton of content, because rather than going into specific details of just a few measures, the more specific I get, the less likely it is that it's going to apply to you. If I go broad, then you can mix and match what's going to suit your team and your ambitions. I ordered the productivity measures into 5 categories, and they're all kind of a subject matter to analyze. So I'm not telling you everything that's going to work in each category. I'm just going to give about 5 suggestions each, but keep those subjects in mind and think for yourself of what it is that you could do in those areas that could be helpful. So the categories are managerial awareness, design and pre-production, the team efficiency, moral and momentum, and finally, the physical environment. So what I mean by managerial awareness is that seeking knowledge in itself is a measure. By internalizing certain concepts, you can affect micro decisions throughout the whole of development. For instance, the compounding effect that I just said, that you need multiple measures that are stacked, is just a good example of how it's going to affect how you think. You will look out for ways to find multiple solutions, so you won't feel as powerless in that mindset than if you're looking for that one big magical solution. You're going to be more patient, and you will have better trust in yourself that you can attain what you're looking for just by thinking this way. So the big one, and I'm very happy because it was said multiple times already this morning, crunch sucks. So what does it mean to have a no crunch policy? We've had studies for over a century that all clearly point out that it's not an effective method past maybe a couple of weeks. So once you accept that it is not effective, you must strike it out entirely from your repertoire of options. And so you take every measure to avoid that, because then you're just stuck with nothing. That also means, in our case, that we don't allow voluntary overtime unless it's justified by the employees that are more zealous. Because even if it's voluntary, your employees might not realize that they're burning themselves out. They don't realize that they put pressures on others to do the same, because everybody wants to be noticed by their team and they want their impact to be at least equal to their peer. And they don't realize it, but they're scrambling plans and probably even causing bugs. So yeah, just be very conservative in your deadlines and don't allow overtime unless it's absolutely necessary. There's a lot of management concepts that have fun names and smart insight that are pretty easy to look into. So I won't go into the details of all of them because there are wikis, there are books, there are podcasts, but I'm just going to name a few of those to give you a starting point, and then you can kind of crawl through the rabbit hole of productivity. The first one is probably the most known, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which describes how beginners tend to overestimate their own competence. But there's also the mirror way of the same Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that experts often underestimate the knowledge gap there is between where they're at and the uninitiated. Then there's a Peter principle, which states that people get promoted up to their level of incompetence. Then there's the Parkinson's law, which says that work will always expand into the amount of resource that you have allocated to that task. And finally, there's the 4 stages of competence, which can be very good at identifying at what stage professionals are in specific skills. So those are just notions, and you need to take them to heart. It's not just to know that they exist, but to really put them in your mind, to internalize it, and find concrete ways, not just, oh, it sucks that it's like that. Just find concrete ways to mitigate the problems that are demonstrated in those concepts. One core aspect of my work philosophy has always been to have a bottom-up approach to management. What that means is I want to rely as much as possible on the analysis and on the technical efficiency of the people doing the work, and let them make as many decisions as possible, rather than have a top-down approach, which is to have the managers impose decisions on their staff. And this is especially potent if you reduce the overhead. So try to have as few layers of management as possible, because information is lost in every layer. So yeah, cut all the middle managers you can. Job management isn't about deciding how something has to be done, but rather to identify the goal for the whole team and let the team decide. Listen to your experts when they explain what is possible or not and what are the most efficient ways to get there. Another concept that's pretty close to the Parkinson's law is the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto law. It has many forms, but in this case, it's to specifically talk about the fact that the approximation that 20% of the work you do will bring up 80% of the results. And then you do 80% more work to get the last 20%. Game developers are really perfectionists, and they place the bar super high. When you let it go unchecked, they will put in a disproportionate amount of time to hit a bar that is probably not needed. Will most players notice that your animation could have needed one more cleanup pass? Probably not. Will they care that your system that you've programmed can't handle a few exceptions? Maybe not. Choose which of your aspects in your game deserve to really go to that 100%, and which ones are actually going to be okay at 80. And that will allow you to either finish faster your production or to squeeze in more content into it. And in my experience, and when you look at what has been popular on Steam and console, I'd say players tend to prefer a quantity of feature more so than a streamlined experience. I'd say games that are messy get popular even for their messiness because it comes with a lot of emergent gameplay. So really, 4 features at 80% are usually worth more than 1 feature at 100%, and they're kind of the same cost. And I know I'm a developer, and everybody here is a developer. I know it hurts to stop before we get to the very best we can attain for that one specific task. But when you do that, often you're missing the forest for the tree. Where I feel most studios have the most to gain is in changing their approach to pre-production, and to have higher expectation of what your game designers should do and how rigorous they should be towards themselves and their creative leads. The majority of indie studios, they seem to think they just need a gimmick or a genre to copy, and that they will figure things out as they go. And yeah, that can be very wasteful. On the other side, we've got larger studios, which have a much more complex pre-production process, and they will have very detailed plans, but they also tend to make big changes right in the middle of production. It can be very disruptive. I've heard so many horror stories of developers who told me about 60% of the work they had done had been thrown to the trash, and they just kept working over and over again. And then those AAA studios, they compensate by just brute forcing the problem with more staff, and they just spend a lot of money, and more staff very quickly hits a diminishing return. Okay, I know it's really a cliche to say you need a defined vision, but there's a lot of misunderstanding of about what it means to have clarity of vision. It does not mean knowing all the details. It means understanding what it is that will make your game set itself apart. Why would players care about the difference in your game? And what are the pillars in your design that you need to attain that goal? It's a lot easier to understand what are the right pillars, what is the right game to make, when you are part of the audience yourself to the game you're trying to make. So we hear so many things, especially in schools, because they want to make people who are ready to be employees for someone else, and that they got to be flexible. And so you need to, you want to work on AAA games, but then you're told, oh, you need to be open to working in mobile games. But the truth is, you're going to make better decisions if you understand the player, and there's no better way to understand the player than if you just have an actual, not forced interest into that. So game design pillars are often confounded with key features. They're not the same. Your pillars are meant to justify which features to put into your game and in what way to execute them. So for Outward, for instance, I was getting tired of how almost every RPG was a power fantasy. And so we decided, instead of doing that, we will focus on what is going to make an RPG that is more immersive, even if it means breaking that power fantasy that the player is now very used to. Deciding that, we knew that it inspired how to make our magic system, the importance of having survival mechanics, and inventory management, which is something where usually there's not a lot to think about. So yeah, clarity is essentially understanding purpose. That one is a bit harsh to accept, but in your whole career, you're probably going to work on less than 15 games. It just takes so much longer now than it did before. So you need to ask yourself, why would I use one of my less than 15 slots to make that game rather than anything else? Once you understand the answer to that question, a lot of your answers will come naturally. Once you know what game you're making, the team should try to make a list of every single development task required. Yeah, I know it sounds very precise and very daunting, but you need to do it. And you ask your team to evaluate how long they think each and every one of those tasks is going to take. I know that information is going to be missing when you're doing that process for the first time. There are stuff that will be considered probably overscoped, and there are things you're going to be forgetting. But just doing the exercise that first time and having the whole team involved in that process will allow you to find your blind spot early. When I do that process at 9dots, we can take a few days, sometimes a whole week, just on that. But it gives us so much speed after because we know where we want to go. And doing that can bring the big conversations before it's too late. It can allow you to decide before you even get started in production that it's time to scale down, or maybe even just cancel the project. And you'd rather cancel it then than much later once you've got years of investment into something that you could never have finished. One of the best starting points to get an idea of all the tasks is to have your game designer, even if they can't document everything, they should start by making a table of content, and then just give that table of content to your whole team and let them try to think of everything it involves. Okay, speaking of scope, make sure you identify early what are the features that are flexible in their scaling. For instance, for us making an open world RPG, it sounds extremely big, and it is, but it gave us a lot of different levers for scalability. In mid-production, we realized, okay, we're taking much longer than we thought making the environments, outdoor environments, more precisely. We were okay with dungeons. And we also had found very neat ways to create creatures super fast. So we decided that we would reduce by half the amount of outdoor environments, but use those same resources to double the amount of creatures that were in the game. And we also compacted those dungeons that we had for 8 regions into 4. So by cutting by half the amount of region and doubling down the number of creatures, I feel that we even got a better game in return, and it was cheaper to make that way. When writing down the design, focus your conversation on the intent behind a feature or a system. Stay as flexible as possible on the form in which that intent will manifest. Countless times I went to one of my programmer and I suggested, you know, I want to make this kind of feature. I want to attain that intent. Here's my proposal on how to do it. And then I'd be hit with an answer like, that's going to take me, I don't know, 3 months to make. What about instead we do it this way? And it's almost the same, but by doing that, it's only half as much work. It happens all the time. And every single time that I've received that kind of suggestion, it's just a big, fat, juicy yes. But if I had just forced the feature itself rather than the intent behind, the conversation would not have happened. And also sometimes they hear the intent and they have a better suggestion for the same amount of work. So it's either costing you less or you get a better product in the end. Another aspect that was a bit random, if you don't have a non-compete agreement and your staff has free time, it means that they're gonna have side projects. And they can apply what they learn on those side projects to when they come back in office. At 9dots, we went from making we made a space combat simulator, and then we jumped into an open world RPG. And we did that kind of seamlessly because one of our artists and our lead programmer decided for fun to do a side project that had some action RPG elements. So give room to your developers and to grow outside of the company, and you're gonna reap the rewards. It's a random payoff. It could be small, it could be big, but truly it doesn't cost you anything, and it's just a free lottery ticket. Okay, team efficiency could mean on pretty much everything I said so far and everything I'm gonna say after. So here it's more concretely, what are the actions you can take to make your team a better whole? So cohesion is not guaranteed. Even if you have super talented and experienced developers, you need to make conscious decisions to ensure that they merge together well. The most obvious decision, and once again, we've heard that in previous talks as well, you need to hire the right people. Some specific qualities to look for, in my opinion, once again, mileage may vary, but hire only gamers, hire highly autonomous people, hire people who are willing to do more than just a job description. And I know that those qualities can be super rare, especially finding them all together in the same person. But more than once, I was in a situation where I had an urgent need for a role to fill, and I had a very limited amount of candidates to choose from. And I would pick the one that was the least worst instead of finding the perfect fit. And I've regretted it every time. And it's also not fair for the person that you are hiring. Every time they're not going to stay, they're not going to fit in. So even if the pressure is super high, you need to have the patience and accept the bottleneck and keep looking rather than pick an employee that's going to be subpar or just not a good fit. It's almost always better to have a smaller team that works for a longer period of time than a large team over a small period. Less people means less codependencies, less meetings, less information loss, easier tracking, more accountability per person, more trust in between everyone. 90% of the time, what a team of 5 people can do in 2 years is going to be superior in result and cost less than if you have 10 people working for 1 year. And a longer gestation period allows a game for more tweaking phases. And there's this concept that I don't hear much about when talking production, but there's a maturity that a game can reach when all of its systems gel together. And that is just easier to get when your ingredients marinate together for longer. Once you have the right people, you need to give them the right motivation and the space to perform. That comes in the form of autonomy and ownership. Each of your employees should have a mandate that they own. So on Outward, it's pretty extreme. We had only one animator. We had only one writer. We had one programmer who handled pretty much everything gameplay and graphics, and the other one handled all the systems and the UI. To have one person who knows everything in a specific category, how every asset intersects, prevents a lot of confusion, and it also gives them the perspective to think of very ingenious way to reuse their content and their work. But of course, if a team member tells you that they cannot do everything you're expecting of them, you need to listen. But do not subdivide your work to a point where the person working on it doesn't have agency. Once you do that, you slow down to a crawl. Regarding your pipeline, no matter how efficient it is, there's always going to be a curveball thrown at you and something that's going to disrupt the process. When that happens, just observe how you can avoid that reoccurrence, and very often that's just by adding a conversation phase in your pipeline. So that's kind of a sanity check, which happened on Outward. We had a couple of instances where a creature had been developed from concept art to final model or almost final model, and only then would our animator look at it and say, that's going to bring a lot of problems in the attacking motions. And so he was kind of stuck with a model, and the quality of the combat experience was affected. Just adding that a checkup straight during concept art to have the animator look at the concept art and say, okay, yeah, I have enough room for all the attacking motions. That saved a lot of problem. Actually, it never occurred again. We had that problem solved just by adding a very short phase during the pipeline. So it's really just an exercise of spotting your blind spots and bringing all the eyes that you need early on during conception. Okay, I know it sounds very abstract, change breeds alertness, but whenever you do an organizational change, you will put your team in alert mode. So unless the new configuration that you're trying is absolutely horrible, you will observe a surge in productivity for a short while due to the novelty effect of that change that you did. It's kind of a reset in perceptions, and it can help flush away bad habits that seeped over time. especially for habits of procrastination. So I have a very small recommendation. Just shuffle the team placement every X month in the studio, and it has the added benefit of not only people are more alert because they're sitting somewhere different, but because they're going to be sitting to someone else on the team, it helps create new bonds, and it makes the colleagues get closer just organically. There's not much that will push a team more than motivation. Whenever your team feels like they're moving forward, their motivation is maintained. Some aspects are super obvious, like you want to feel like you're doing your best work, you want to care about the project you're working on, and you want to feel progress, both your personal progress and that the company is progressing. But there's more to it that are a bit more subtle. There's nothing that kills motivation more than wasting your efforts. So avoid having wasteful goals. Vertical slices are one of the most disruptive, useless, self-defeating practices in the industry. Games are intertwined sets of rules, and they work by having all of those rules working together. Faking that takes so much effort, and the resource that you put into that faking could actually just be put into the actual game instead. And those vertical slices are almost always used to prove something to an executive who doesn't really understand production. But you can find ways around them. At 9 Dots, we've never done a vertical slice. We've been around for almost 12 years now. And they also come, almost all vertical slices come with deadlines that are too tight because studios know that it's wasteful and they just want to compress it to as few weeks as possible or as few months as possible. So that's just doubling down the effect of how wasteful it gets. In the same vein, the arbitrary definition of an alpha or a beta can really go against the flow of production. So I suggest, like, I know it's harsh, but completely cut away vertical slice from your development process and make sure that your definitions for alpha and beta are as loose as possible. If you're working with the publishers, it will be part of the contract. They will have a definition of what an alpha and a beta is, and there are sometimes some trappings in there, but it can be negotiated. I've done it for the contracts that I've signed, and you should too. Just like a lot of other studios at 9 Dots, we work in sprints, and there's a very small thing that we do that I haven't heard many other producers talk about. Whenever there's a task that ends up taking a lot more time than what was planned, instead of forcing the person with that task to finish it on time for the end of sprint, we will switch up the problematic task with another one that was for the future that is taking an equivalent amount of time. Equivalent amount of time to the initial projection. Then we can take into account the new information we have about that task that is more problematic and put it in a future sprint instead. By doing that, you are cutting down on that feeling of being overwhelmed for the person who got that task that is delayed, and it also prevents them rushing everything else around that task to kind of just make sure that it finishes on time, which can come with problems later down the line. 9 Dots work on very deeply systemic games, so all systems need to work together. Most of the time, the order of development that we chose to do was what I call horizontal rather than vertical, because we need to work on a lot of feature A just so that it works with feature B that needs to work with feature C. So yeah, everything was just kind of moving up a little bit at a time instead of having one feature complete and then moving on to the next. It worked really well, but only for a while, because we were working on, for the first two projects, they had a very small development cycle. They were 1 year and 2 years and a half each. But we hit a snag during Outward. uh, simply because we were not used to a very long development cycle. It lasted 4 years, and I had underestimated the impact of project fatigue. So in the beginning, we were going super fast because we were highly motivated, but eventually we really got slowed to a crawl, and people stopped trusting that we could finish the game because nothing was ever finished. So by the time we hit the third year, we changed our approach, and instead of just maximizing development speed on a theoretical perspective, we thought what would maximize morale instead. And so we decided, okay, we're gonna pick one category of features that we're gonna move so far ahead that it will feel like we're getting close to one thing that's gonna be the final product. In our case, it was survival elements. So we had food and we had the systems, but none of them were tweaked tight. We just spent a whole sprint on nothing but survival features. So we had all the assets for the tents, we put in all the recipes for cooking and all that. And we saw a huge boost in motivation of the team. And from then on, we had a theme for every sprint. And that meant that every time you would have this this vertical bar that gets close to the finish. And even though we had to come back to the features that we had almost finished developed, because once again we didn't have the other features together, that loss in time was compensated by just the velocity we had in development, so it was worth it. So my suggestion is, while you have the novelty effect, be as horizontal as possible, just to cut down on the total development time in theory. But once you see that project fatigue kicks in, that's when you start working in verticals. There is an impact on staying in stealth mode that is very understated. So we often see games that are worked kind of in secret and you don't show them to anyone for a couple of years. But when you are not showing the game to anyone, your developers can start seeing only the glass as half empty instead of half full, because their job is to look at what's not done yet and to work on the bugs and the problems. So when you have the enthusiasm of players about the game you're working on, it can compensate on that effect and maintain motivation. And it's even better if they have access to a build that they can play at on a trade show like PAX, for instance, or Gamescom. And it's really just a good tool to renew the faith in the project with the team, because usually players are going to be enthusiastic, and if they are not, it also confirms the suspicion of the developer. They feel like they're not crazy. So it's a win in either cases, unless it's just abysmal reception. In those demos are often better deadlines and better milestones to attain than alpha or beta. So keep that in mind. And one thing though is that does not apply the same way for games as a service and for early access. It has an adverse effect actually on productivity, because you need to constantly maintain everything, which will slow down the development of new features. If there is no breathing room in your schedule, it actually makes it harder to finish everything on time. So you want to have time to assess if you're going in the right direction. During outwards development, about every 6 months, we realized that we were probably moving too fast in one direction or another, and we were not sure if we would hit a wall. So we had to stop everything for a week and reevaluate the task list. The same process that I described that we did at the very beginning, we would do it over again every 6 months or so. And this is a very critical moment, because if we did that, it's because we weren't sure if we were gonna run out of funds before we would have a finished product. So it might seem very painful to actually stop production and just spend so much time on reevaluation, but it's really worth it. And now what we do is every 4 months, it is planned in advance. We have this 1 week of in-between sprint transition period where we reevaluate everything, and we also use that time to encourage the developers to add stuff that is not part of any sprint, is not part of any task list, so they can add in some Easter eggs, try new feature, get more experimental. And that's what's gonna make your game feel like a labor of love rather than just a list of assets put together. The last category, not the least, it has a much bigger impact than what people credit it for also. How you configure your space and your time will change your productivity. And it's going to be very observable. I see so many studios, both the big and the small, who just work in big open space. They give unconstrained flexibility in time for their staff. They can come in whenever they want, they can leave whenever they want, and they also allow remote work. However, honestly, this is just not a mature way to work. So part of 9Dot's success was based on the fact that we all work in a shared office. I know that it's all the rage to talk about remote work, but watching other people working is in itself a very strong motivational tool. Procrastination when alone at work, alone at home, is just more likely to happen for most people. I know there's different profiles, different people, but when you're building a team, unless you have a team that's entirely built around the idea of effectiveness in remote work, chances are they're going to be more effective, more productive if they're working in the same environment. But yes, I admit that there are a lot of distractions when in a physical space, and yeah, people don't like commuting to come to work, and it's more comfy when they're in their bedroom with their pajamas. But without the daily interaction between your peers, it's much harder to build and nurture a corporate culture. And distrust can come very naturally, just because you don't really know the people you're working with. When you have a shared space, it will also bring a lot of spontaneous conversation that will not happen with scheduled Discord call and stuff like that. So there's what I call these invisible problems that only are invisible when in remote work, that will get very obvious just because there's going to be echoes of conversation in the room that will bring problems to the attention of just more people without being necessarily that distracting. It's just that you overhear something and it becomes part of a larger conversation. There's also the principle of integrating your juniors. Juniors tend to not want to disturb the senior staff, and having to poke them directly to do that invasive action of sending a notification to someone who you know is already working can be very difficult. There can be a barrier. When you're just next to someone, you can be like, hey, I got this problem, can you help me? It just happens more naturally. And then finally, for your retention of your staff, there's no reason to be attached to a studio if you're working in rework, in remote work. So then you only have the attachment to the project. So if the project falls aside, or once you change project, then you will lose more of your staff that's going to be leaving because you did not have that bond that you get from shared physical space. One of the key elements to being productive is to have synchronicity, and that's a lot harder to do if you can't access the people who are working with you at all time. How often are you working on a game and you just need to talk to a programmer or an animator and they're just not there because, well, they already left work or they're coming in like 2 hours after that, after you arrived. So you need to think that for 1 hour of flexibility, that's 2 hours during the day where those two people cannot reach each other. So it creates micro bottlenecks that can very accumulate quickly, and that's kind of how you get a traffic jam when you look at real life dynamics of cars, and that can arrive in your pipeline as well, just because you do not have synchronicity, because you're too generous in your in how you manage your time for your employees. I know that having good software and good hardware is it's very obvious for AAA studios how important it can be. But when you're strapped for cash in small indie studios and startups, you can get to a point where you're skimming on your tools. And sometimes it's even without you knowing it's happening. There was a while during development where I was unaware that there were some workstations for some employees that would slow to a crawl, like less than 1 frame per second when they were working in engine. And whenever they tried to render anything, it was taking super long. I've always been transparent with the team, and they knew that we were in a precarious situation, so they did not want to ask me to pay for more, for better hardware. Their intent was noble, but the effect was the opposite of what they wanted, because salaries are extremely expensive, and if you can improve just 10% of their productivity by paying, I don't know, $2,000 for a better computer, it's always going to be worth it. Even in the midterm, it's not even the long term. It very quickly justifies itself. If you tell your team that, if you inform them of how you'd rather pay for stuff to accelerate them than have them not ask you for anything, they will come up with new solutions, and they can surprise you with new software, new hardware that you maybe did not even think of that can give you very nice speed bumps. It can be very difficult to get into the zone, and it's extremely easy to lose your focus. So the disposition of your desk can actually make a big difference. You want to find the right balance between easy access to your peers and reducing movement in peripheral view and reducing noise. So the most simple of trick is to have all your desk, or as many as possible, facing a wall. And as you can see, we had some separations there. It's not like a cubicle. It's just allowed them to really get in the zone, tunnel vision on their screens, and it was very appreciated by the whole team. You also want to look at how you do the disposition of your desks so that you avoid high traffic areas going just behind somebody or next to them. So I know it's very precise, but what I found so far was that having small clusters of 6 developers was just the best. Once you get at 8 or more in a tight-knit space, it gets very noisy very quickly, and every person you add, it ramps up exponentially in the amount of distraction and noise. And also the size of the rooms. Usually it's better if you have rectangles rather than squares, just because it gives you more flexibility in how you place your desk around walls and such. Oh, I've merged together 2 slides at once. So yeah, disposition of desks. I know I gave you a lot of suggestion. It was really a rapid fire. In the end, like I said, you want to compound your effects, and you only get results when you put something on top of your priority list. We get productive because we focused on attaining that. There might be many ways to achieve productivity. Many of those ways could directly contradict what I've said today. You just need to find what works for you, but you need to look for how you're going to attain productivity. Don't expect it to happen by accident. So just be mindful, observe your results, and adapt. Like I said, it will not happen by accident. So here's a little mental exercise. What would it mean if every measure that I've suggested added 5% efficiency? If it's compounding and not just 5% plus 5% plus 5%, you compound it, that's theoretically a 238% productivity gain. I know it sounds exaggerated, it's probably not that simple, but we are in a very competitive industry. So could you really afford to not improve your productivity by just even 15%? Probably not. So apply all the solutions you can. Thanks.
We do this. So thank you. Is there any questions on this talk, predictive talk on productivity? Over there. I'm a ninja.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. Vertical slice. um, let's pretend I'm a studio putting out a first game, working on a first game. I'm looking for a publisher, investors. I think I need a vertical slice. I'm stupid, right?
It's not stupid because they will ask you to have a vertical slice, but it's just because they don't know better. If you offer to them, it's not going to be a vertical slice, but I can give you that instead, and you give them the caveat, it's not a vertical slice. But you have some things in there that are polished, but they're actually going to be polished like that in the final game. That can be enough to impress them. Also, on your first game, honestly, in my experience, unless you have, like, I'm not Thomas Giroux. I didn't have 20 years of experience, so I had to prove that I could actually do it by already having finished one game before signing a publisher. And if not, they will sign you probably when you're already close to finish. So might as well just hurry to that finish line rather than take time to do a vertical slice. That is very likely to not be enough to gain the trust from publishers, in my experience. But if not, like I said, negotiate with them, explain what you're making, and also having you can have two different assets. So you have a demo that is not a vertical slice, but you also have, say, a video that explains what you're targeting for experience, and that can cost you less to make than actually playable vertical slice.
Hi, I'm Jean-Gobert de Coster, CEO of Fantomata. We make games for children. I have two questions, actually. One is just out of pure curiosity, which is which tool do you use for project management for games?
So we use Redmine, which is a very basic tool. It's even less complex than Jira, but also more reliable. So we use that for tasks. And we've incorporated some process for power tracking in there. That's pretty much it. And we use Plastic for asset management.
Okay, and then the more complicated question would be: so we talked a lot. You talked a lot about how to manage a project. Now, what about the transition from one project to another? And the baby blues that follows when you finish the first project, you know that you don't really want to finish it because, you know, you want to keep working on it and transitioning. How do you handle that?
Very poorly. No, so it's a hard one because I had two very different situations that I faced. For God Factory, we had to leave it too soon because it was just not successful at all. And we had to just jump to survive. And so we were kind of on adrenaline, so we didn't have to put much more in place to manage it, and maybe it was a mistake, but it was just everything is on fire, so we just need to make something now. And honestly, we did have one employee who had severely affected in terms of mental health because of that failure and having to transition so quickly. He didn't have time to say goodbye to his baby, I guess. So sadly, for that situation, I didn't have much to say. For Outward, what helped was because it was successful, we could work on it for DLCs and subsequent patches and stuff like that. And so we could get tired of it and excited of the new project. So if the game is successful enough that you can maintain it, it actually helps that transition. And also, one really nice thing about DLC or just support in general, whether it's paid or not, if you continue, you can just bring the game that much closer to the promise that we all had internally. So for instance, in the Soul of Orients, our first DLC for Outward, we added enchanting, but that's a system that we had to cut super early on in development for the main game. But once it feels like it's finished, truly finished, then moving on to the next one is more than welcome. They will hastily get towards the next one.
Hello. I would like a question. First of all, about ownership you talked about before. The first one, you said let your team have ownership over features and stuff. I agree, it's a very good thing. But you developed with a small team, right, on Outward? My question would be, can't it backfire you at some point? Imagine someone, you are designing a dragon, someone get the ownership on this dragon, and since you are a small team, there's an issue. The person who has the ownership leave the studio. So, don't you think maybe having your developers have some versatility or trying different stuff on the production and not holding this ownership too much would be a better thing?
I get where it comes from. It's really a case of what you gain versus what you lose. And I've always focused on momentum, just maintaining momentum. And there's two things with that. One, when you feel you have momentum, you're less likely to leave. So that's already kind of self-mitigating. But I agree with you. When somebody leaves on a team like ours, it hurts like hell. And there's no reason to panic because while that person is gone and there might be bottlenecks in your production, at the same time, it's one less salary to worry about. So once again, there's the issues that come with it have self-mitigating issues, self-mitigating aspects to them. So yes, you are exposed, but that's kind of like in a real relationship where you trust your partner and you have to give more and ask for more rather than stay distant to make it work. I think that doing that for your employees is just the best way. It just allows them to grow faster. So it's good for your employee to do it. And in general, if something is good to do for the employee, unless it's very destructive for the studio, I think it's as much as possible what you should be doing.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this presentation. My question would be, you said earlier with the development of the game, like you have to forget about alpha or beta state of the game, but I want to say as a gamer, in the opposite, we totally see the opposite actually on the market because almost 6 game of 10 lives in alpha or beta like in Steam or Epic Games or something like that. So why every game now just come up in early or alpha or beta instead of have the finished game like before?
So there are multiple reasons to do that. One, it's more often than not, it's just because they don't have the funding to finish. It's a Hail Mary. It's a big leap of faith to go there because making games is expensive and there are so many people trying to do it that only so many projects can be funded. And so they try to prove themselves that way. The other aspect is it can be a very helpful tool if you have a community-centric approach to marketing. And so in that regard, that's pretty cool. But the most successful early access titles, well, it's not always been the case, but nowadays, they release in a state that could be the final product in some cases. And yet, they get very successful. And what those gamers see as a beta or as an alpha very rarely actually is a beta or an alpha from a real production when you're keeping everything close. So it's difficult because the terms change depending on who's looking at it and whether or not it's a good marketing stunt to name it that way or not.
Sorry again. You answered a question about being hyped about other project feature that need maybe to get removed or add in DLC in your case. Lucky you. It would be when it happens, when you realize a feature, a task is mid-production not working. How do you deal with that? Because you still have. Did it happen on Outward, for example? So how did you deal with that? Because you are in mid-production, you still have time. Maybe you can try, or you can cut it because it's starting to bleed. So how did you react in that kind of case?
It goes back to what I was saying about going back to your task list and analyzing everything. You will just see, oh, we are just getting over budget, and now we need to kill our babies. And so it's really just a matter of accepting that either you kill some or you kill them all because it's not going to get to the end. So it's really decisions that impose themselves. And after that, it's really just finding out what is a priority. And I said early, like in the very beginning, you need to identify your pillars. Then you will see from your pillars what are the features that intersect with as many pillars as possible. If they are kind of really fitting into exploration, but not in everything else, maybe that's where you need to cut. We had something really interesting in the design of Outward, which is initially we had the intent to have an experience system where you gain experience point when you kill creatures and stuff like that. And we realized our progression systems was too spread out and we didn't have time to finish it all. And so we made that decision that got super appreciated by the audience that you cannot actually level up. And they said, that's so different. Now what levels up is your own skills and knowledge as a player, but your character is really improving with skills that you learn from trainers, but there's no experience points anymore. So cutting smart was actually noted as good design decisions that were appreciated in the game. It's surprising how often that can happen. Like designing in negative space can heighten the quality of your project, even if you didn't foresee it that way.
Yes, time for one last question.
When you finish a game and you're ready to start a new project, what do you do with the old game and the HUTPAD that was still possible and the DLC that you wanted to add in the game?
One thing I like is reassuring your team that what you're not doing in that one game is still going to be viable information and concept to apply in the next game. So there's a very nice promise there. You cannot, like if you just keep working on that one game forever, you got like this ceiling that you can't get past because you're on old tech, because you made design mistakes that you have to keep dragging with you forever. So just reassure your team and yourself by putting forward the stuff that you could not improve on and mix it with, okay, so we wanted to do that enchanting system, for instance. Let's say the enchanting system from the Soulborians would have never made its way into Outward, but we wanted to do it. Well, Outward has a ton of weird quirks because we had to develop it so fast and with so few people. And then I could expose, now we have a higher budget and we've learned from our experience. So for the next game, we're going to apply all of that, gain momentum, and we're also more likely to be able to add those extra stuff in the next one. So yeah, just focus on pushing the ceiling higher to the future game.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. You will have the opportunity to continue discussions further, but please join me in thanking Guillaume and also the three other fantastic humans we had this morning. They are all in the room, so I would like you to really give a big applause to all of them. Thank you very much.